It was barely past dawn in Boston's financial district. The pavement still slick with a cold gray mist, when a woman most people had trained themselves not to see, pointed one steady finger straight into the face of the most dangerous man in the city. Her name was Maeve Donnelly. 28 years old, though the streets had a way of adding years no birthday ever asked for. Her coat was 2 sizes too big and fraying at the cuffs, her boots were held together with tape, and her dark hair was tucked under a wool cap that had seen better winters. But her eyes were clear and calm and absolutely unafraid. In front of her stood Kieran Voss, 37, in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people earn in a year, his jaw like carved stone, a faint scar tracing the edge of his brow, and the kind of stillness that made grown men step aside without being told. His men were already reaching into their jackets. The whole street seemed to hold its breath. Maeve didn't, because seconds earlier, this man had stepped out of his gleaming black car and crushed the one thing she had left in this world, a small brass pocket watch, the last piece of the husband she'd buried 3 years ago, and he'd walked on as if it were nothing at all. So she squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and said the words that stopped an entire block cold. "Didn't your mother teach you any manners?" Nobody speaks to Kieran Voss that way. Nobody. And yet, this homeless woman who'd lost her home, her career, her name, and every soft thing life had once promised her, looked into the eyes of a man who could make people disappear and simply refused to look away. What she doesn't know is who he really is. What he doesn't know is who she used to be. And what neither of them can possibly imagine is that the thread connecting these two strangers runs 3 years deep, buried under a secret so dark that when it finally surfaces, it'll shatter everything they thought they understood about that terrible night and about each other. If this kind of story moves you, do us a small favor. Tap that like button, share this with someone who believes people deserve to be seen, and subscribe with notifications on so you never miss what happens next. Now, let's get back to that cold morning in Boston, where one broken woman just told the most feared man alive to mind his manners. The question hung suspended between them like a blade that had not yet decided which way it would fall, and Kieran Voss repeated it once more. Slower this time, his voice lower. The voice the entire city had learned to fall silent at the moment it heard it. "Do you know who I am?" But Maeve only looked at him with eyes that never blinked, then gave the faintest shake of her head and said she didn't know, and she didn't believe it mattered, because whoever he was, he had still just crushed something that didn't belong to him, and walked on as though the ground itself had been made for him to trample beneath his feet. Then she asked him a question no one on that street would ever have dared even to imagine, whether the importance of who he was made what he had done any less wrong, because from everything she had seen, the more people feared a man, the easier it became for that man to forget the most basic way a decent human being was supposed to behave. When she finished speaking, she didn't wait for his response. She dropped to her knees in the cold mist that lay across the sidewalk, her knees touching the damp concrete, and both hands began searching among the broken pieces. That was when everything inside her quietly collapsed, because what lay scattered beneath his feet wasn't trash, and it wasn't something that could simply be bought again. It was the dented brass casing, the snapped needle, and the shattered glass of the only thing that still carried the warmth of a hand that no longer existed in this world. Her fingers trembled as she picked up each fragment, trembling not from the cold, but from a pain far too familiar, rising inside her once again, and she placed every piece carefully into her other palm, as though there might still be some way to put them back together, as though time itself might turn backward if only she were gentle enough. The entire street remained there watching. His men still kept their hands inside their coats, waiting for a nod, but that nod never came, because Kieran Voss was staring down at the woman kneeling at his feet, and something very strange was happening behind his eyes. Something that had slept in silence for a very long time suddenly stirred. He watched those trembling hands. He watched the way she cradled fragments that were worthless to the rest of the world, yet were an entire world to her alone, and something he had believed long dead inside his chest began to ache with a dullness he couldn't name. He had stood before hundreds of people who wept and begged. He had watched men fall to their knees before him and plead for mercy, and not once had he been moved. But this woman wasn't asking him for anything. She wasn't asking for pity. She was simply gathering the pieces of her own sorrow in silence, and somehow that made him feel small in a way he never had before. Then, to the astonishment of everyone standing around them, Kiran Voss himself bent down. The straight, expensively tailored line of his back folded over the cold sidewalk, and the fingers that hadn't picked up anything dropped or scattered in years reached toward a tiny shard of glass still lying beside the gutter. He lifted it awkwardly, almost hesitantly, then placed it into her open palm. In that moment, when their hands nearly touched, the distance between the most powerful man in the city and the woman who had nothing vanished completely. He raised his eyes to hers and spoke a word that the men who had followed him for years had never once heard him say to anyone. "I'm sorry." Only 2 words, dry and clumsy, like a language he had never learned how to pronounce, but they were real. Maeve lifted her head and studied him for a long moment, as though weighing how much sincerity lived inside that apology. Then she nodded slowly, not the nod of someone who had forgiven him, but the nod of someone acknowledging that, at the very least, he had finally done one thing right. She closed her fingers around the broken pieces, rose to her feet, brushed the damp dust from her knees, and quietly said that she hoped the next time he walked through this world, he would remember that the small things lying beneath another person's feet were sometimes all that person had left. Then she turned away and walked step by step into the gray mist as it slowly dissolved beneath the first sunlight of the day. She didn't look back even once. She left behind a man standing rooted in the middle of the street, a man who, for the first time in his life, had no idea what order he should give next. He remained there, watching her slender figure disappear into the crowd, while his palm still held the cold memory of the broken glass, and inside his chest, the thing that had stirred moments before was now fully awake and refused to go back to sleep. The black car rolled away from the financial district through a silence so dense it seemed to have weight. Kiran sat in the back seat, his gaze fixed on the window as the city drifted past in blurred streaks of gray. Yet in truth he saw nothing, except the image of a pair of trembling hands gathering broken pieces from a cold sidewalk. And that unsettled the man sitting across from him in a way he couldn't quite name, because Thaddeus Reyes had walked beside Kiran Voss for 11 years. Long enough to read every shade of his employer's silence, like a map known to no one else. In all those 11 years, he had never once seen Kiran turn his head to look back at anything he had left behind. Not a face, not a name, not a street, because that was the unwritten law by which this man lived. What was over no longer existed. What stood in his way was removed. What had ceased to be useful was forgotten. Yet now, Thad was watching his boss tilt his head toward the window, like a man who had dropped something important and didn't know how to go back and find it. He knew something had changed. He simply didn't yet know what. It wasn't until much later, after the glass towers had fallen behind them and given way to the familiar roads along the harbor, that Kiran finally spoke, his voice low and flat like still water before a storm. He told Thad to find out everything about the woman from the street corner that morning. Her name, where she came from, who she had once been before she became someone sitting at the edge of the world that way. Thad lifted his eyes to him through the rearview mirror, struggling to keep his face as neutral as a wall, though inside he had gone still. In 11 years of service to Voss Group, he had received countless orders that made people disappear, orders that caused an entire dock to change hands overnight, orders he had carried out without asking a single question, but never before had he been given one as strange as this. It wasn't meant to punish anyone. It wasn't meant to seize anything. It was simply meant to know, to understand. And it was precisely that harmlessness on the surface that sent a colder shiver through him than any threat ever had. Because Thad understood better than anyone that when a man like Kiran Voss began wanting to know about another human being, that person, whether willing or not, had already been drawn into a world very few entered, and emerged from unchanged. That world had a name Boston spoke only in whispers: Voss Group. On the surface, it was a transportation and real estate corporation with brightly lit office towers and lawful contracts stamped with red seals. Beneath that polished shell, however, lay an intricate network controlling the ports, the warehouses, and the rivers of money moving through the city after dark. It was an empire built on silence and fear, with Kiran Voss seated at its summit like a shadow. Everyone knew was real, but no one dared name aloud. Through all the years he had occupied that throne, he had grown so cold that even he had forgotten he had ever been capable of warmth, until that morning. until those trembling hands. Thad pulled out his phone and typed a few brief instructions to his people, though his eyes never left the motionless figure of his employer in the back seat. A strange feeling rose inside him, half curiosity and half a vague premonition that something was about to begin. He found himself wondering who the woman in the old knit hat truly was, and how, with nothing more than a few words spoken in the middle of a street, she had managed to do what no enemy, no rival, and no bullet had accomplished in 11 years. She had made Kieran Voss turn around and look back. When the car turned into the estate hidden behind rows of leafless trees, Thad glanced into the rearview mirror one final time and saw that his boss was still clenching his right hand into a fist, as though the cold of a shard of broken glass remained trapped in his palm and he couldn't make himself let it go. And Thad understood that whatever was beginning, it had already begun, and there was no way left to stop it. While the black car disappeared behind the rows of trees surrounding the estate, Maeve had already walked for nearly an hour to return to the place she called shelter, a dry patch beneath the overpass spanning the river on the southern edge of the city, where the endless groaning of traffic overhead had become so familiar that she had come to think of it as a kind of lullaby. When she slipped through the opening in the chain-link fence and stepped inside, a rough voice greeted her from the darkness. It belonged to Hollis, a man past 50, with a scraggly silver beard and eyes that always carried the quiet humor of someone who had lost nearly everything, but had somehow held on to his kindness. He was the first person who had shown her where to hide from the wind, which places the police tended to patrol, and how to keep her feet dry through a Boston winter. During the months she had spent drifting through the streets, he had become the closest thing to family she had left. Hollis took one look at her face and fell silent. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply shifted aside and made room for her on the worn sheet of cardboard. Maeve sank down beside him and opened her palm beneath the dim light spilling from a street lamp above, revealing the broken pieces she had clutched tightly throughout the entire walk back. The bent brass casing, the snapped hand, the tiny shards of glass. Only then, when there was no one left before whom she needed to appear strong, did she allow her shoulders to sag, because that pocket watch had never been merely an object. It was the last fragment of another life, a life where she wasn't a shadow on the pavement, but a woman who was loved. The watch was a first anniversary gift from her husband, who had told her that the time they had together was the only possession truly worth keeping. But 3 years ago, a sudden tragedy took his life, leaving her entirely alone. Soon after, a devastating turn of events at her hospital job stripped away her nursing license, leaving her ruined, jobless, and eventually homeless. One step at a time, she had slid all the way to the bottom, until everything left of her existence was crammed into an old backpack and the shattered pocket watch now resting in her palm. Hollis sat beside her without saying a word. He only rested his calloused hand gently on her shoulder, the gesture of a man who understood that some grief didn't need comfort, only the presence of another human being. Maeve closed her fingers around the broken pieces, pressed them against her chest, and lowered her head. At last, she allowed the tears to fall in silence. There were no sobs, no cries, only quiet trails of tears from someone who had learned that crying louder wouldn't change a thing. In the darkness beneath that overpass, with the constant roar of traffic above, she wondered how much a person could lose before there was nothing left to take. She didn't know that on the other side of the city, inside a warm and luxurious room beyond anything she could imagine, a man had just ordered her entire life pulled apart to discover who she truly was. And she didn't know that her name, the name that had been buried for 3 years, was about to be spoken aloud again in a way that would change everything. 2 days later, after night had settled over the estate and only the glow of a desk lamp spilled across the dark wood-paneled walls, Thad entered Kieran's study with a thin file tucked beneath one arm, and an expression he had tried to keep neutral throughout the entire walk up the stairs, but couldn't completely conceal, because what he had uncovered had forced even him, a man who believed nothing could surprise him anymore, to read the documents 3 times just to make certain he wasn't mistaken. Kieran looked up from the untouched glass of whiskey before him and motioned for him to speak. Thad placed the file on the desk and began with the most harmless information. The woman's name was Maeve Donnelly. She was 28 years old, a former emergency room nurse with a professional license, and a record so spotless it was nearly perfect until 3 years earlier, when everything in her life collapsed within the span of a few short months. Kieran nodded and waited until Thad hesitated, turned to the next page, and spoke the name of the hospital where Maeve had once worked. The moment that name left his lips, the entire room seemed to freeze, because it wasn't just any hospital. It was the very place where, 3 years earlier, on a night Kieran would never forget even if he lived 100 lifetimes, his only younger brother, Julian, had been taken into the emergency room after an accident and had never walked out again. And Thad, in a voice so quiet it was almost soundless, delivered the final piece. According to the internal records his men had uncovered, Maeve Donnelly had been the nurse directly involved in Julian's emergency treatment that night, and she was also the person later held responsible for his death. Her ruined name, her revoked license, her buried career, all of it had begun with that same fateful night. When Thad stopped speaking, silence fell over the room with the crushing weight of a sunken stone. Kieran sat completely still, but the hand holding his glass suddenly tightened until his knuckles turned white. Inside his mind, two images collided with enough force to fracture everything he believed he understood. On one side was the woman kneeling on a cold sidewalk, gathering each broken piece with trembling hands, the first person in years to awaken something that had lain dormant inside his chest. On the other was the cold body of the younger brother Kieran had held in his arms in the morgue, the brother whose grave he had stood before and sworn he would avenge. And now those two images were bound by the same thread. The woman who had made his deadened heart begin to beat again might also be the woman who had killed his own brother. Kieran set the glass down very slowly, as though any sudden movement might cause him to shatter. Then he closed his eyes, while an entire storm of conflict churned behind his stone-still face, because two men were tearing at each other inside him. One was Kieran of the underworld, the man who demanded blood for blood, who insisted that whoever had taken Julian from him must be crushed, no matter who that person was. The other was the Kieran, whose buried humanity had opened beneath the early morning light on the sidewalk 2 days earlier, the part of him that kept insisting that the woman with clear eyes and trembling hands couldn't possibly be a killer, that something in this story didn't fit, that a hidden piece was still missing. Thad stood in silence, watching his employer struggle with an emotion he had never once seen on that face in 11 years, and he was wise enough not to say another word. He simply waited until Kieran opened his eyes again. The shock had vanished from his gaze, replaced by a cold and focused resolve. In a low voice, he told Thad to find every record from that night, every detail, every minute, because before he decided what to do with that woman, he needed to know exactly what had truly happened. Thad nodded, withdrew, and closed the door behind him. Kieran remained alone in the darkness for a long time, clenching the right hand that had held a shard of broken glass 2 days earlier, and for the first time in 3 years, the familiar rage inside him was tainted by something he didn't dare name. Doubt. While Thad continued digging through the events of that night 3 years earlier, Kieran did something whose motive even he couldn't explain. He ordered his men to deliver a thick envelope of cash to Maeve, along with the address of an apartment whose rent had already been paid for 6 months. There was no note and no condition attached, as though his power and money could quietly erase the image of her kneeling on the cold sidewalk, an image he couldn't drive from his mind. His men found her beneath the overpass, placed the envelope and the slip of paper bearing the address into her hands, then left without offering any explanation. The following day, something that had never happened in Kieran Voss's entire life took place. The envelope was returned untouched, not a single bill missing, and the paper with the address was still folded along its original crease. When Thad reported this with disbelief written across his face, Kieran sat in silence for a moment, then did a second thing he couldn't explain. He had Thad drive him to the edge of the district, leaving the car and his guards behind. Slipping into a plain dark coat that allowed him to blend into the night, he walked the final blocks to the overpass alone. He found her sitting beside a metal barrel, where a small fire was burning, holding her hands toward the flames for warmth. When she looked up and recognized him, she didn't seem surprised. She merely raised one eyebrow, as though she had already guessed that a man like him wouldn't accept rejection easily. Kieran asked her directly why she had returned the money. It was enough for her to leave this miserable place, enough to give her a roof, a warm bed. She studied him for a long time before answering, her voice calm, without anger, but without the slightest trace of deference. She said she didn't know where the money had come from. She didn't know whether it was clean or dirty, didn't know who had sweated or bled so that it could exist, and she would rather sleep peacefully beneath that overpass than lie in a soft bed, purchased with something she didn't understand. The one thing life hadn't yet taken from her was the right to hold her head up and look at herself in the mirror each morning, and she wouldn't sell that right at any price. Kieran stood in silence, because for years he had been accustomed to believing that everything and everyone had a price. He had bought officials, witnesses, even the silence of people who should have spoken. Not once had he met someone his money couldn't reach. Yet this thin woman sitting beside a small fire, a woman who had almost nothing left, had refused him as casually as though she were declining a cup of tea, and it filled him with an uneasy mixture of irritation and respect. He asked whether she knew whom she was refusing, and she answered that she still didn't know who he was and still didn't believe it mattered. The only thing she knew was that he was trying to use money to purchase peace for his own conscience, not because he truly cared about her. And if he wanted to feel better about what had happened that morning, that was his problem, not hers. The words were as sharp as a knife, cutting directly into a place Kieran hadn't expected, because they were true, and their naked accuracy left him without an answer. But Maeve wasn't a saint. She didn't speak with the noble air of someone bestowing wisdom. She spoke with the weary honesty of a person who had grown tired of people, who believed money could solve everything. She added that she wasn't especially good or holy either. There had been nights when she was so hungry she had considered keeping the money, but because she knew exactly how easily hunger could make a person fall, she had even more reason to hold on to the last boundary she had left. Once she crossed it, there would be no road back. And Kieran, the most powerful man in the city, stood beneath that overpass amid the smell of smoke and the bitter cold, and for the first time in his life he felt that he was the poorer of the two. He looked at her for a long while, then gave a small nod. He didn't argue. He only said that he understood. Before turning away, however, he stopped and asked a question that surprised even him as he heard it leave his mouth. He asked whether he could return the next day, without money, only to talk. Maeve studied him cautiously for a long moment before giving a shrug and saying the sidewalk belonged to everyone. He could come if he wished. And for the first time in many years, Kieran Voss walked away carrying not a victory, but a question. And he did return. Not just once, but again and again. Throughout the days that followed, Kieran appeared regularly beside the fire beneath the overpass at dusk, still wearing the same plain dark coat, still without an entourage. Maeve gradually grew accustomed to the presence of the strange man she was convinced was nothing more than some arrogant businessman who had grown bored with his own riches, because she could read it in the way he stood, the way he spoke, the bearing of someone accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. Instead of becoming cautious around him, she decided to do what she did with everyone who behaved as though the world owed them gratitude. She began correcting him. The first time was when Hollis brought them 2 cups of hot coffee he had received from a nearby charity kitchen. Kieran took his cup without saying a word, and Maeve immediately raised an eyebrow and stared at him until he irritably asked what she was looking at. She replied calmly that she was waiting to see whether a grown man knew how to say thank you when someone gave him something. That Hollis had walked nearly 2/3 of a mile through the cold to bring back those 2 cups of coffee, and the least Kieran could do was look him in the eyes and offer a proper word of thanks. Kieran froze, turned toward Hollis, and after a rare moment of hesitation, nodded and said, "Thank you," stiffly, like a machine relearning a language that had rusted away. Hollis laughed and declared that the young fellow might still be worth saving, while Maeve nodded with the solemn satisfaction of a judge who had barely awarded a passing score to a struggling contestant. Another time, when a homeless woman passed by and asked to warm herself beside the fire, Kieran instinctively ignored her as though she were invisible. Maeve spoke up again, more seriously this time. She told him that the habit of treating people as though they didn't exist was the most frightening thing a person could possess, that someone who was hungry could still ask for food, but being looked through as though one were transparent was what killed people from the inside. She said a person's character wasn't measured by how he treated those with more power than he had, but by how he treated those who could do absolutely nothing for him. Kieran remained silent for a long time after that, because her words had touched a place he had believed was hardened beyond feeling. What kept drawing him back, again and again, wasn't simply that she was right. It was the way she spoke, without fear, without calculation, without expecting him to grant her anything. She spoke to him with a clear and unguarded honesty he had never encountered in a lifetime spent among flattery, lies, and terror. Beside her, he wasn't Kieran Voss, ruler of a shadow empire. He was merely a man being scolded by a poor woman because he had forgotten to say thank you, and strangely that made him feel lighter in a way power never had. One afternoon, she asked what kind of work he did that made him carry himself with such constant suspicion, as though he expected someone to stab him in the back. Kieran stiffened for an instant, then answered vaguely that he worked in transportation and real estate. She laughed and said that explained everything, because businessmen like him always believed they were far more important than they truly were. Then she teased that if he frowned a little less, he might not look quite frightening enough to scare children. Kieran, the man whose presence made an entire city hold its breath, felt the corner of his mouth lift almost without permission, something very close to a smile, something Thad would never have believed if he had witnessed it himself. Their conversations continued that way. Some days they spoke about small things, like the meal she missed most from the years when she still had a kitchen of her own. Other days they talked about Hollis and the terrible jokes he told that somehow made everyone beneath the overpass laugh aloud. And through every scattered fragment of conversation, Kieran felt himself being drawn toward this woman, slowly and irresistibly, not because she was beautiful or fragile, or in need of protection, but because she possessed something his entire empire couldn't purchase. She still looked at the world with an unbroken belief that human beings, no matter how far they had fallen, deserved to be treated as human beings. And he, who had spent his whole life proving the opposite, began to wonder whether he had been wrong all along. But that newly awakened feeling had barely begun to take root before it was cut down in a single evening, when Thad entered Kieran's study and placed on the desk a file many times thicker than the first one, complete, detailed, stamped, and copied directly from the hospital's own archival system, records his men had paid a considerable price to obtain. As Kieran turned each page beneath the desk lamp, the part of his humanity that had slowly opened during those evenings beside the fire began to close again, layer by layer, like ice reforming over the surface of a lake that had only just begun to thaw, because everything written in black and white stood in complete opposition to the woman he had believed he was beginning to understand. The records clearly stated that Maeve Donnelly had been the primary nurse on duty the night Julian was brought in. They stated that mistakes had been made during the monitoring and treatment process. They stated that the internal investigation that followed had assigned responsibility to her, resulting in the revocation of her license and the destruction of her career. It was all there, unmistakable, cold, and merciless, much like the nature of Kieran's own work. He sat before those pages for a very long time, feeling as though someone had poured ice water into his chest, because over the past several days he had allowed himself to forget why he had first sought her out. He had let their conversations, the cups of coffee, and her blunt reprimands lull the original, ruthless purpose from his mind. Now the file struck him like a slap, dragging him back into reality. The woman he had nearly allowed himself to trust, the woman who had made his lifeless heart begin to beat again, might very well be the person who had taken Julian from him, the only younger brother he had left in this world, the brother whose cold body he had held in the morgue, and before whose spirit he had sworn that his death would never be allowed to disappear into silence. The familiar rage, the rage that had slept through those gentle afternoons, now rose more violently than ever, mixed with something even more bitter than anger, the sense that he had been betrayed by his own heart. He cursed himself for being foolish enough to let a face and a few kind words deceive him. He, a man who had built an empire on suspicion and cruelty, had nearly fallen before the very thing he should have distrusted most. Thad stood in silence and watched his employer's face harden once more into the familiar mask of stone. He realized that the spark of humanity that had begun to glow inside Kieran over the past few days had been extinguished. In its place stood the man Thad had followed for 11 years, cold, precise, and dangerous. Kieran closed the file with a decisive motion and rose to his feet. In a voice so flat it was frightening, he told Thad that he needed to see her that night, alone. Thad hesitated and asked whether they should wait until everything had been verified more thoroughly. Because he knew this man well enough to understand that when Kieran Voss walked away with that look in his eyes, someone usually paid the price. But Kieran merely put on his coat and said that he didn't need anything else verified. He needed to look directly into her eyes and ask her himself, because if she had deceived him all these days with that clear and innocent expression, then he needed to witness the moment her mask finally fell. Throughout the drive back to the familiar overpass, Kieran sat in the back seat, his hands clenched into tight fists, while the image of those trembling fingers gathering broken pieces from the sidewalk echoed through his mind, now darkened by the shadow of the pages he had just read. He no longer knew what was real and what was false. He knew only that the small measure of peace he had just begun to find had vanished, and in its place a cold storm was gathering, ready to break over the woman beside whom, only a few hours earlier, he had hoped to spend one more quiet afternoon. Kieran found Maeve sitting alone beside the dying fire, and the moment she looked up and smiled in greeting, as she had on every other evening, he threw the file onto the ground before her. The pages spilled across the cold concrete, and in the voice that had frozen over once again, he asked whether she recognized the name written there, whether she remembered the night 3 years earlier in the emergency room, whether she remembered a man named Julian Voss. The instant she heard that name, the color drained from Maeve's face. Not with the shock of someone whose secret had been exposed, but with the horror of someone being dragged back into a memory she had spent 3 years trying to bury. She lowered her eyes to the scattered records, her trembling hands turning the pages, and when she understood who the man standing before her truly was, and what place he held in this story, tears filled her eyes. But she didn't step back. She rose and faced him, then said in a voice tight with emotion but steady in its certainty that she remembered. She remembered every minute of that night more clearly than any other night of her life. She told him that the young man had been brought in with severe injuries after an accident, his blood pressure falling dangerously low, and that she and the emergency team had followed every procedure correctly. They had started an intravenous line, secured his airway, monitored every reading, and called the attending physician at the proper time. She had remained beside him throughout it all, never leaving him for even half a step. Near dawn, his condition had begun to stabilize, and she had truly believed he would survive. Then everything had deteriorated suddenly and unnaturally in a way she still couldn't explain from a medical standpoint, because what was happening inside his body didn't match the injuries he had suffered. She told Kieran that she had reported the abnormal signs that very night and documented her suspicions. But when the internal investigation began, her notes disappeared, the medical records were altered, and the words she had written were replaced by something else. Suddenly, every measure of blame fell upon her. She became the perfect scapegoat, a nurse who had recently lost her husband, a woman already breaking apart, without money or influence, someone easy to destroy and discard. As she spoke, tears ran down her face, not the pleading tears of someone begging for pity, but the tears of an injustice sealed inside her for 3 years and finally finding a crack through which to escape. Then she told him something that left Kieran completely still. She said there was one detail she had never shared with anyone, because no one would have believed a woman whose credibility had already been stripped away. That night, she had briefly seen a strange man near Julian's room, someone who wasn't wearing medical clothing, wasn't a relative, and wasn't a hospital employee, a man she had never seen before and would never see again. She remembered thinking his presence was odd, but she had been too busy fighting to keep her patient alive, to give it further thought. Then her voice began to tremble as she added that in Julian's final moments, when she bent close to him, he had tried to whisper something. His lips had moved almost soundlessly, and through all the chaos of the emergency room, she had heard only one name escape with the last of his fading breath, a name she had never understood during the 3 years since, and had never dared repeat because she was afraid. She lifted her eyes and looked directly into Kieran's, then said that if he truly was Julian's brother, she needed him to believe one thing. She hadn't killed his brother. She had fought to save him until she had nothing left to give, and she had paid for a crime she didn't commit with her entire life. Kieran stood rooted in the darkness, the cold rage he had carried there suddenly shaken to its foundations, because nothing in her account, not her eyes, not her voice, not the medical details far too specific to invent, sounded like the words of a liar. And the stranger she had seen in the hospital that night began to plant a terrible suspicion inside him. The possibility that for 3 years he had been seeking vengeance against the wrong person, and that the truth behind Julian's death was darker than anything he had ever imagined. Kieran didn't sleep that entire night. Maeve's account echoed through his mind again and again. The medical details too precise to dismiss, the missing notes, the strange man inside the hospital, and above all, the name Julian had tried to whisper with his final breath. Together, those fragments formed a picture that grew more disturbing the longer Kieran studied it, because the official version of his brother's death suddenly seemed wrong, in a way that was impossible to ignore. The following morning, he summoned Thad and ordered him to reopen everything connected to Julian, not only the hospital records, but every trace his brother had left behind before he died, because Kieran had suddenly remembered something he had overlooked during 3 years consumed by grief and rage. Julian hadn't been an idle young man without purpose. He had been the person Kieran trusted to review the accounts and transportation routes of Voss Group. He possessed a meticulous mind and the habit of recording everything, and if he had discovered something unusual before his death, there was a strong chance he had left evidence somewhere. It took Thad several days to trace an old storage account Julian had created under a name no one had ever noticed, and when they finally opened it, what they found inside left both men silent. There were rows of spreadsheets, photographs of financial documents, and hurried notes, all showing that during the final months of his life, Julian had been secretly investigating an irregular stream of money flowing out through the company's transportation network. Shipments had been falsely reported, discrepancies had been siphoned away with care and consistency, and the missing sum was far too large to be an accounting mistake. It could only be organized embezzlement. More frightening still, the clues didn't point toward some outsider. They led directly into the company itself, toward people seated near the highest levels of Voss Group, people Kieran had trusted for years. Julian had marked several transactions in red and written initials beside them that Kieran didn't understand at first, until he realized they were the codes Julian used for those with the authority to approve the contracts. 2 names appeared more clearly than any others. The first was Finnegan Walsh, the man responsible for coordinating the shipping routes at the port, someone Kieran had always considered so loyal that he had never believed surveillance was necessary. The second was Corinne Ashford, the company's sharp and ambitious attorney, the woman who controlled nearly all its legal documents and whom Kieran had long trusted with its most sensitive affairs. The further he read, the colder his blood became, because if Julian had uncovered this operation, then he had become a direct threat to the people behind it. His death, which Kieran had spent 3 years believing, was caused by the negligence of a nurse, now appeared beneath an entirely different light, darker, colder, and far more deliberate. Thad carefully reminded him that these were still only scattered pieces, that nothing yet proved Walsh or Ashford had directly arranged Julian's death, and that there could still be others hidden in the shadows whom they hadn't discovered. He warned Kieran that if these clues were real, then their enemy wasn't somewhere outside. Their enemy was already inside their own house, sitting beside them at the same conference table every week, and that made every next step infinitely more dangerous. Kieran nodded, his face now carrying a cold concentration entirely different from the blind rage that had ruled him for 3 years. He understood that the woman beneath the overpass, the woman upon whom he had nearly unleashed his fury, wasn't only innocent. She might also be the sole surviving witness to that fateful night. His thoughts returned to the name Julian had whispered into her ear before dying, the final piece that, if fitted into this picture, might reveal the mastermind behind it all. He instructed Thad to keep everything absolutely secret. No one within the organization could learn that they were reopening the case, because from that moment forward, a single careless word could become a death sentence, and inside him a new resolve began to take shape, not only to uncover the truth for Julian, but also to restore justice to the woman who had carried another person's guilt for 3 years. Kieran decided to seek out the only person who could confirm Maeve's medical suspicions. a retired forensic pathologist he trusted, and when he showed the old doctor the original medical records Thad had managed to obtain, along with the notes Julian had left behind, the man studied them for a long time with a deep frown before revealing something that caused every scattered piece to lock together into a horrifying picture. He pointed out that Julian's sudden deterioration during his final hours, the very thing Maeve had sensed was abnormal, didn't match the progression of an accident victim who had begun to recover. Instead, it corresponded with disturbing precision to the symptoms caused by a toxin introduced into the body through an intravenous line. A substance that was difficult to detect, broke down rapidly, and left no trace unless the correct tests were performed at exactly the right time. In other words, Julian hadn't died from the accident, nor had he died because of any medical error. He had been poisoned in his hospital bed, in the middle of a crowded emergency room, and the accident that brought him there might not have been an accident at all, but merely the first stage of a coldly calculated plan to silence him forever. When this was combined with what Julian had preserved in the storage account, the entire conspiracy emerged with chilling clarity. During the final months of his life, Julian had discovered that Finnegan Walsh, the man who coordinated the shipping routes at the port, had joined forces with Corinne Ashford, the company's attorney, to systematically drain money from Voss Group. They falsified shipping records, created fraudulent transportation contracts, and diverted company cargo to a rival organization in exchange for enormous payments deposited into their private accounts. Finn controlled the operational side, allowing him to manipulate the port records, while Corinne controlled the legal side, enabling her to legitimize every document and erase every trace. Together, they formed an almost perfect partnership. Julian, with his meticulous habits, had accidentally noticed the discrepancies, and the deeper he investigated, the clearer the truth became. He had gathered evidence and had probably intended to present it to Kieran, but he never had the chance because they struck first. They realized Julian was a mortal threat. Once he spoke, they wouldn't merely lose their stream of money. Their lives would also be in danger, so they decided he had to be eliminated before he could reveal anything, and they carried it out with such precision that they transformed a murder into a death that appeared to have resulted from medical complications. But the most vicious part of their plan was that they needed someone to take the blame, a perfect excuse that would allow the investigation to close without anyone looking more deeply. Maeve Donnelly was the ideal scapegoat, the primary nurse on duty that night, a woman who had just lost her husband, who was emotionally shattered, without money, influence, or anyone standing behind her. All they had to do was alter a few lines in the records, make several notes disappear, and steer the internal investigation toward her. Everything could then be wrapped up neatly. Julian's death would be blamed on one individual's negligence, the file would be closed, and no one would trace the filthy money behind it. While the true killers continued occupying positions of power within the company, an innocent woman was stripped of everything and thrown to the lowest edge of society, forced to bear the punishment for a crime she had actually been the only person trying to prevent. Kieran listened with both hands clenched so tightly that his skin split and bled because he understood a truth more bitter than anything he had imagined. For 3 years, he had directed all his hatred toward the wrong person. He had allowed the real killers to remain beside him, sitting at the same table, drinking from the same bottle, while the only person who had fought to save his brother was treated with suspicion and had nearly been punished by his own hand. What frightened him most wasn't the cruelty of the conspiracy, but how close its architects had been. They weren't enemies from outside. They were people within his own house, names he had once trusted completely. And now that he knew the truth, he understood that this game was far more dangerous than he had ever believed. When the first shock began to fade, Kieran started examining the entire board, with the cold eyes of a man accustomed to calculating every move, and the longer he thought, the more clearly he saw something that sent a chill down his spine. Maeve wasn't merely an innocent woman who had been falsely blamed. She was the only surviving witness from that night, the only person who had stood beside Julian's hospital bed during his final moments, the only person who had seen the abnormal symptoms with her own eyes and managed to record her suspicions before those notes were erased. More important than anything else, she was the only person alive who had heard the name Julian tried to whisper with his final breath. The name Kieran now believed was the key that could identify the mastermind behind everything, that transformed her from a forgotten scapegoat into the most dangerous threat to the people responsible for the crime. Kieran traced their reasoning backward and finally understood why they had allowed her to remain alive for 3 years. In their eyes, destroying her credibility had been more than enough. They had turned her into someone whose words carried no weight at all, a nurse, stripped of her license for negligence, a mentally broken widow who had lost her mind after her husband's death, a homeless woman barely surviving beneath an overpass. Even if someone like that came forward and spoke about the strange man inside the hospital, or about the name she had heard from the lips of a dying patient, no one would bother believing her. People would simply dismiss it as the invention of a bitter woman trying to escape responsibility. That was why they hadn't dared to kill her back then, with old Benedict Voss keeping a suspicious, watchful eye on the closed files. A sudden murder would have raised too many questions. Instead, destroying her credibility and keeping her under a silent, crushing surveillance was far safer. They calculated that a disgraced, broken woman living on the streets was as harmless as a dead one. And for 3 years they had been right. Until now. Until everything changed because of one variable none of them could have anticipated. Kieran Voss, the most powerful man in the city, the only person with enough strength and motive to reopen the entire case, was now sitting beside that very witness, every afternoon beneath the overpass. Kieran shuddered as he understood what that meant. As long as Maeve remained an unknown woman no one trusted, she was safe. But the moment they discovered that she was close to him, that he was listening to her, that the mouth they had believed silenced for 3 years had suddenly found a powerful pair of ears, willing to believe it, every layer of their protection would collapse. She would no longer be a harmless witness. She would become a ticking bomb that had to be dealt with immediately. The threat they believed they had neutralized 3 years earlier would be active once again. And this time they wouldn't make the mistake of allowing her to live. Kieran understood that his own concern, those afternoons he had spent seeking her out beside the fire, the very thing that had begun pulling him out of darkness, might also be the thing that pushed Maeve toward death. The cruel irony of it left him struggling to breathe, because she still knew nothing. She still believed he was merely a grim businessman, whom she was trying to teach how to behave like a decent human being. She didn't know that simply sitting beside him was enough to place a target on her back. Kieran summoned Thad and issued his orders with a rare urgency in his voice. Maeve was to be watched and protected day and night, but with absolute discretion. She couldn't be allowed to notice, and no one inside the organization could learn of it, because the smallest mistake revealing that he cared about this woman would be no different from pointing directly at the place where their enemies needed to strike. Thad accepted the order with a heavy heart, because he understood that the game had entered a new and far more dangerous stage. This was no longer merely about reopening an old case. It had become a race against time to protect a human life. Both men knew that Maeve would remain safe only as long as the secret held, but secrets like this, in a world filled with watching eyes and listening ears like the world of Voss Group, never remained hidden for long, and just as Kieran had feared, the secret didn't remain hidden for long, because in the world of Voss Group, where every powerful person had eyes and ears of their own, the fact that the boss had repeatedly driven alone to the overpass at dusk couldn't escape notice forever. The first person to sense that something was wrong was Corinne Ashford. Because Corinne wasn't the kind of woman who could be deceived easily. She hadn't risen to her position through luck, but through a mind as sharp as a blade and an almost merciless ability to read people. She had grown up in poverty and watched her mother be crushed by those who possessed money and power, and from an early age she had told herself that there were only 2 kinds of people in this world, those seated at the banquet table and those lying on the menu. She had sworn she would never belong to the second kind. That cold ambition had brought her to Voss Group, and it was also what had led her to join forces with Finn to drain the company from within. Not because she lacked anything, but because she wanted enough power and money to ensure that she would never again depend on anyone's mercy. In her eyes, Julian had been nothing more than an obstacle standing in her way. Now, when her people reported that Kieran had been spending time with a homeless woman beneath an overpass, her keen instincts immediately sounded an alarm. She ordered an investigation, and when the name Maeve Donnelly appeared, along with the history of a former nurse connected to the night Julian died, the blood in Corinne's veins seemed to freeze. She understood at once what had taken Kieran days to piece together. The witness she had believed permanently buried beneath the filth of disgrace 3 years earlier was now sitting beside the most dangerous man of all. If Kieran chose to listen to her, if the name Julian had whispered as he lay dying was spoken into the right ears, then the entire fortress of power Corinne had spent years building would collapse in a single night. And it wouldn't merely collapse. She would lose everything, her freedom, her fortune, and perhaps even her life. Corinne wouldn't allow that to happen. She summoned Finn to a private meeting in a deserted office late at night, and in the frighteningly calm voice of someone discussing murder as though negotiating a contract, she told him about the threat now rising before them. Finn, a man more accustomed to action than thought, immediately panicked and demanded that they strike at once, but Corinne dismissed the idea. She warned him that any clumsy move now could arouse Kieran's suspicion and drive him to investigate more deeply. The woman's death had to look natural, accidental, like the inevitable misfortune of a homeless person living on the streets, a robbery that turned violent, an accident in the night, anything, as long as it left no thread leading back to them. Finn nodded, and beneath the dim light of that room, the same two people who had coldly poisoned an innocent man 3 years earlier once again decided the fate of another human being, simply because she knew too much. Yet what made Corinne terrifying wasn't her naked cruelty. It was the way she continued to maintain a flawless appearance, smiling politely in meetings, playing the role of the devoted and loyal attorney beside Kieran, concealing the monster within behind a mask so carefully polished that no one could ever suspect the truth. During the days that followed, an invisible net began tightening around Maeve without her knowing. Strange faces appeared near the overpass. Unfamiliar cars remained parked at the end of the street longer than usual. A silent threat was closing in little by little, while, on the other side of the city, Kieran was still racing to gather enough evidence, unaware that his enemies had already moved one step ahead of him and that the blade was being sharpened. That night, the air turned colder than usual, and beneath the overpass, Hollis sat beside the small fire and told Maeve a story he had never once mentioned during all the months they had known each other. He said that many years earlier, he had possessed a home, a job, and a little daughter whom he loved more than life itself, but illness had taken her before she ever had the chance to grow up, and the grief had drowned him, slowly pushing him out of his old life until he became the ragged man sitting there now. He told Maeve that from the day he met her, watching the way she remained strong, while still holding on to her kindness, in the midst of such hardship, he had seen in her the shadow of the daughter he should have been allowed to watch grow into a woman, and in his heart, he had come to think of Maeve as his own child. He said that if life still allowed him to do one final decent thing, he hoped it would be to see her find her place in the world again. Maeve listened with burning eyes, took his calloused hand in hers, and told him that he was the only family she had left as well. In that rare moment of warmth amid the cold, neither of them knew that the darkness around them was moving, that unfamiliar shadows had quietly drawn closer from the other side of the chain-link fence. Hollis was the first to sense that something was wrong. The instincts of a man who had survived on the streets for far too long made him fall suddenly silent, his ears straining toward the soft scrape of footsteps that didn't belong there. Then everything happened very quickly. He shoved Maeve hard toward the opening in the fence and shouted for her to run, his voice urgent and commanding in a way she had never heard before. Maeve stumbled and turned back, trying to pull him with her, but he had already placed himself between her and the shadows rushing forward. He yelled at her not to stop, to keep running and find help. In the chaos of that darkness, Maeve heard only the brutal sounds of impact, bodies struggling, objects crashing to the ground, and Hollis grunting through the fight. Every sound struck her like a knife, while her legs carried her forward in obedience to his final command. She ran from beneath the overpass, crossed the dark street, and plunged into the night with her heart pounding wildly and tears streaming down her face. She kept running until she reached the lights of a gas station that was still open and screamed for help. Only minutes later, the guards Kieran had secretly stationed around the area arrived. Men who had been watching from a distance but had been drawn away that night, by a staged disturbance at the far end of the street. By the time they reached the overpass, the attackers had vanished into the darkness, and Hollis was lying beside the fire, which had nearly burned itself out. He had used his own body to buy Maeve enough time to escape. They rushed him away that same night, but his injuries were too severe, and before dawn arrived, the man who had once lost his own daughter died after saving the daughter fate had sent him near the end of his life. Maeve collapsed when she heard the news. She had lost her husband, her career, and her home, and now she had lost the only person who still regarded her as family. She clutched his old knit cap against her chest and wept without sound, tormenting herself with the belief that she should have been the one lying there instead of him. In the midst of that unbearable grief, a cold question began to form inside her mind. Why would anyone want to hurt a homeless woman who had nothing left? Why had those shadows come for her with such deliberate purpose? The guards, acting under Kieran's strict and urgent orders to prioritize her safety above all else, immediately secured the area and gently guided the devastated Maeve into the waiting car, driving her away from the bloody scene and straight toward the secure sanctuary of the estate. The attack hadn't been random. Their enemies had made their move. His worst fear had become reality, and the blood of that kind man, however indirectly, was partly on his own hands. Kieran wouldn't allow her to remain there for another minute. He met her at the gates of the estate hidden behind rows of trees, his face drained of color, because he understood immediately what Maeve hadn't yet had time to grasp. And only when the heavy gates closed behind them, when Maeve stepped into a world of soaring ceilings, dark wood-paneled walls, and men in suits standing guard at every entrance, did she begin to understand who the man she had scolded beside the fire every afternoon truly was. When she asked him directly, Kieran no longer tried to avoid the truth. He told her about Voss Group, about the underground empire over which he ruled, and about why the entire city held its breath whenever his name was spoken. Maeve stepped backward, her whole body seeming to freeze, because the man who had quietly sat beside the fire and listened to her speak about kindness, the man she had begun to trust, was the very embodiment of the ruthless world of power that had destroyed her life. She was torn between anger at having been deceived and the undeniable truth that he had just saved her life. In a trembling voice, she asked whether Hollis had died because of him, and Kieran didn't hide from the question. He admitted that the attackers had targeted her because she had grown close to him, and that he would carry the weight of that truth for the rest of his life. But he also told her everything he had uncovered, that his brother Julian was the young man she had tried to save, that Julian hadn't died because of negligence but had been murdered to silence him, and that she had done nothing wrong. She was an innocent woman who had carried false blame for 3 years. Maeve stood motionless as she listened. 3 years of injustice, 3 years of having the entire world turn its back on her. And now, for the first time, someone was telling her that she was innocent. The cruel irony was that the person saying it belonged to the very world she hated most. In the heavy silence that followed, something between them began to soften, and Kieran, a man who had never spoken to anyone about himself, began to tell her his story. He spoke of his childhood beneath the hand of his father, Benedict Voss, the man who had built the empire with blood and fear. He told her that from the time he was very young, he had been taught that kindness was a dangerous luxury, that emotion was an opening through which an enemy could slide a knife, and that survival required crushing every softness inside oneself before someone else could exploit it. His father had forged him into a cold weapon and punished every sign of feeling as though it were a failure. Kieran had grown up believing that was the only way to survive in their world, until a poor woman beneath an overpass, a woman who possessed nothing, dared to look him directly in the eyes and tell him that a person's character was measured by how he treated those who could do nothing for him. That sentence had followed him through many sleepless nights. Maeve listened as he spoke, and the anger inside her slowly gave way to a sorrowful understanding. She said quietly that she was sorry for the little boy, who had been taught that he wasn't allowed to be gentle. Then she looked directly at him and said something he would remember for the rest of his life. Kindness had never been the weakness his father claimed it was. Holding on to kindness in a world that was always trying to crush it was the hardest thing of all, and it demanded the greatest strength. A truly powerful man wasn't one who made others afraid. He was one who still dared to be kind even when he had every reason to become cruel. Chiron fell silent before those words, because they overturned everything he had been taught throughout his entire life. In his eyes as he looked at her was something both painful and yearning, the look of a man daring, for the first time, to believe that he could become someone different. They sat together in the vast, silent room, and what passed between them wasn't hurried romance, but the first fragile beginning of understanding between two wounded people, each carrying scars of their own, each realizing for the first time that perhaps they had never been as alone in their pain as they had believed. The days Maeve spent living in the estate passed like a dream she could never fully relax into, because each morning when she woke beneath soft blankets with sunlight filtering through the heavy curtains, a nameless sense of displacement rose inside her. She, who had grown accustomed to the cold beneath the overpass, to the smell of smoke and the endless groaning of traffic overhead, now found herself surrounded by a luxury so complete that even the silence felt foreign, and the contrast made it impossible for her to forget that this place had been built by the very kind of power that had destroyed her life. She walked through hallways lined with expensive paintings, watched men in suits lower their heads and call Chiron boss, and reminded herself that every brick in this mansion might have been paid for with someone else's sweat or tears. Yet what tormented her most wasn't the splendor of the place, but her own heart, because the closer she came to Chiron, the harder it became to maintain the distance her reason told her she needed. She caught herself waiting for the evenings when he returned, and sat across from her at the long table, when the cold armor of the crime lord fell away, and all that remained was a weary man covered in scars she was slowly beginning to understand. They talked late into the night, sometimes about Julian, sometimes about ordinary things, and within the silences between their words, a quiet, aching tension continued to grow, an attraction both of them felt but neither dared to name. There were moments when he handed her a cup of tea and their fingers brushed, making her breath catch. There were times when he looked at her longer than necessary, and she had to turn away to hide the heat rising into her cheeks. Each time it happened, she scolded herself and wondered how she could allow her heart to respond to a man who belonged to the very world that had taken everything from her, how she could sit in the home of a mafia boss and forget that men like him, and the shadow empire he ruled, had indirectly caused Hollis's death only nights earlier. She thought of the kind man who had fallen to save her, and felt shame pierce through her, as though allowing herself to feel any warmth now was a betrayal of him. She thought of her late husband, of the shattered watch she still carried inside her backpack, and wondered whether her heart was betraying that memory as well. At night, lying awake in the vast and unfamiliar room, she was torn between two selves. One was the wounded woman who had learned not to trust anyone, and who built walls around herself for protection. The other was a part of her she had believed dead for years, the part that longed to be truly seen, to have someone remain beside her, the part that responded to the awkward tenderness Chiron was slowly learning how to offer. She hated herself for allowing that part to live again, because she knew better than anyone the price of giving trust to the wrong person. She had once possessed everything, and had lost it all, and the fear of losing again was so great that sometimes she wanted to pack her old backpack and leave, simply to preserve whatever small piece remained inside her. Yet every time she considered going, she remembered the look in Chiron's eyes when he spoke of a childhood in which he had been taught to crush every trace of softness. She remembered the way he had fallen silent when she told him kindness wasn't weakness, and she realized that this man, terrifying though he was to the rest of the world, was changing because of her, struggling to relearn how to be human. That made walking away even harder. One evening, while rain tapped softly against the windows, they sat together for a long time beneath the warm light, speaking very little, surrounded by a silence filled with everything they hadn't dared to say. In that moment, Maeve felt the distance between them grow dangerously thin. She found herself leaning toward him as though pulled by an invisible force, then stopped herself at the final second, her heart pounding, because she knew that once she crossed that line, there would be no way back. She wasn't ready to give the last fragile piece of herself to a man whom both reason and memory warned her to distrust. Chiron seemed to sense the struggle inside her, and what unsettled her most was that he didn't push. He simply drew back and gave her the space she needed. Such gentle patience from a man with so much power made her heart sway even more. When she returned to her room that night, she stood for a long time beside the window watching the rain, holding tightly to the backpack that contained the broken watch, and for the first time in years, she admitted to herself that she was afraid. Not of the people hunting her beyond the estate walls, but of the feeling growing inside her chest, a feeling that was both life returning and an abyss she might fall into, and if she did, she didn't know whether she would still have enough strength to climb out again. As Kieran followed the final clues and tried to assemble the whole truth, he realized there was still one link he couldn't explain. How had the internal investigation 3 years earlier been closed so quickly and cleanly? How had every damaging note disappeared without anyone among the family's most trusted men asking questions? The answer could come from only one person, the only man who had possessed enough power at the time to order a matter closed without anyone daring to object. His father, Benedict Foss, was now a dying old man confined to a bed in a sealed room of the estate. The body that had once spread fear throughout the city, reduced to a wasted figure struggling to breathe through machines. Kieran entered his father's room with a question burning inside his chest. He sat beside the bed and asked directly whether Benedict knew anything about the truth behind Julian's death. Through the clouded eyes of a man standing at the edge of life, Benedict studied his remaining son for a long time. Then, instead of denying it, he slowly closed his eyes, as though the burden he had carried for 3 years had finally reached the moment when it had to be laid down. He began to speak in a broken voice. He confessed that he had known. He had known Julian hadn't died because of the accident, or because of negligence. He had known from the beginning that someone within their own house had been responsible. The admission struck Kieran like a blow that stole the air from his lungs. He demanded to know why. Why had his father known and done nothing? Why had he allowed the person who murdered his own son to remain free? Benedict, with rare tears gathering at the corners of eyes that had never wept throughout an entire lifetime, explained the ruthless reasoning that had tormented him for the past 3 years. At the time, Benedict knew Julian had been poisoned by someone inside, but the traitors had covered their tracks flawlessly. Sensing his health rapidly failing, and knowing his active power was slipping away, he found himself surrounded by enemies both inside and outside his house. He knew that raising suspicions without concrete proof would trigger an internal coup, destroying the family entirely before he could unmask them. To protect his remaining son, Kieran, and keep the empire from collapsing, he had to swallow his grief, shut down the official investigation, and allow the blame to fall on a helpless scapegoat until the day the truth could safely be brought to light. He had chosen the only path of survival left to him. He had ordered the investigation buried, allowed the killers to escape for the time being, and worst of all, agreed to let the blame fall upon an innocent outsider, a nurse without power or influence, because that was the only way to close the matter without awakening suspicion. Benedict admitted that he had known the woman was innocent. He had known he was condemning a stranger to hell in order to save his empire, and the decision had devoured him every night until this final hour of his life. He said he had told himself that he was sacrificing one person to save many, that it was the cold price a ruler had to pay, but deep within he knew he had only been creating excuses for the cowardice of a father who couldn't face the truth that the very world he had built had swallowed his son. Kieran sat frozen beside the bed, his entire body trembling beneath a storm of emotions, with nowhere to go. He wanted to hate the man for selling away Julian's justice and burying the life of an innocent woman, yet at the same time he was shaken by the terrible tragedy of a father trapped between 2 choices that both led to loss. In that wasted figure he no longer saw only a monster. He saw a man who had become a prisoner of the unforgivable decisions demanded by the empire he himself had created. Benedict reached for his son's hand, his own trembling hand nearly without strength, and whispered his final plea. He knew he didn't deserve forgiveness and wasn't asking for it, but he begged Kieran to do what he himself hadn't possessed the courage to do. Finish what Julian had left unfinished. Bring those responsible into the light. Restore the good name of the woman he had cast into darkness. And don't allow this empire to turn you into what it had turned him into. In that moment, Kieran understood that the burden of an entire bloodline, steeped in guilt, had fallen upon his shoulders, that the truth he had uncovered didn't merely expose the traitors, but revealed the decay buried within the very roots of his own family. He understood that the road ahead was no longer simply about revenge. It was a choice about the kind of man he intended to become, whether he would become like his father, or choose to be different. With the full truth finally exposed, and the evidence Julian had left behind secure in his hands, Kieran decided he wouldn't act as his father once had. He wouldn't answer darkness with more darkness. Instead, he chose a move so unexpected that his enemies wouldn't have time to defend themselves. He summoned a private meeting attended by every major figure within Voss Group, and inside the vast conference room with its long polished table, Corinne and Finn entered without the slightest idea that this would be the most decisive meeting of their lives. Corinne wore her usual flawless appearance, a sharply tailored suit, a courteous smile, and the composed manner of a devoted corporate attorney. Finn appeared more uneasy, his eyes constantly moving around the room, as if though some instinct warned him that something was wrong. Kieran sat at the head of the table, calm in a way that was almost terrifying, and he began not with accusations, but by placing each piece of the truth before them one by one. The financial tables Julian had quietly collected, the falsified shipping records, the streams of money flowing out of the transportation routes and into private accounts. Every document that touched the table was like an invisible knife, and Finn's face grew paler with each new piece of evidence until he could no longer control himself and leaped to his feet to deny everything. But his panic condemned him more clearly than any confession could have done. Kieran continued. He presented the forensic pathologist's conclusion that Julian had been poisoned, and when that word entered the room, the air seemed to freeze. Every pair of eyes turned toward the two people seated there. Finn finally broke. He began stammering, placing the blame elsewhere, declaring that Corinne had been the true mastermind, and that he had only followed her orders. In the chaos that followed, what stunned everyone most was that Corinne remained seated without the slightest sign of fear. She slowly placed one hand on the table and let out a quiet, cold laugh. Then, instead of denying the accusation, she did what no one expected. She admitted it. She said it was true. She had designed everything. With the calmness of someone who believed she had nothing left to lose, she revealed the darkest part of the scheme, a part even Kieran hadn't known. She explained that 3 years earlier, blaming an unknown nurse hadn't been a convenient or random choice. It had been a cold calculation. She had personally selected Maeve from among all the nurses working that night because she had investigated her carefully and learned that the woman had just lost her husband, was emotionally shattered, and stood completely alone without anyone powerful enough to defend her. Maeve had been the perfect victim, one who couldn't fight back. Even more horrifying, Corinne confessed that she had never truly released Maeve during the 3 years that followed. She had paid people to watch her from the shadows and destroy every attempt she made to rebuild her life. Whenever Maeve found a job, an anonymous phone call ensured she was rejected. Whenever she came close to an opportunity, that opportunity disappeared for reasons she could never understand. The poverty, the hunger, and the life beneath the overpass that Maeve had believed were simply the cruel turns of her own fate hadn't been accidental at all. They had been the result of a deliberate campaign designed to keep the only surviving witness trapped at the lowest edge of society, forever without enough credibility or standing to make anyone believe her. Kieran listened with his hands clenched tightly, because he realized that the systematic cruelty of this woman was far worse than anything he had imagined. She hadn't merely killed Julian and placed the blame on Maeve. She had spent 3 full years deliberately crushing an innocent human being piece by piece, simply to protect her secret. What made the scene even more terrifying was that Corinne showed no remorse. She looked at Kieran and said that in their world, everyone did whatever was necessary to survive. His father had sacrificed his own son for the greater good, so how was she any different for sacrificing a few nameless people in order to rise? The words were sharp and poisonous, deliberately aimed at the wound Kieran had only just discovered about his father. But Kieran didn't take the bait. He didn't allow rage to drive him toward violence as the man he once was certainly would have done. Instead, he rose and told Corinne in a voice both calm and unyielding that the difference was that he had chosen to end that cycle, that she had made the mistake of believing the entire world was as rotten as she was, and that this time there would be no darkness left to protect her. He gave a signal, and the conference room doors opened. But the people who entered weren't armed men in suits, as Corinne had probably expected. They were something that caused the confidence on her face to crack for the first time. Because Kieran had prepared a move for this moment that neither she nor Finn could ever have anticipated. A move that didn't rely on blood, but on the very justice the underworld had always tried to escape. The people who entered the conference room weren't Kieran's men, but federal agents, because over the previous several days, Kieran had quietly done something no crime boss before him had ever dared consider. He had secretly contacted a federal prosecutor and handed over every piece of evidence Julian had left behind, along with the forensic conclusion regarding the poisoning. He understood that, if he dealt with Corinne and Finn himself according to the laws of the underworld, he would only be continuing the same cycle of blood, repaid with blood that had swallowed his brother and turned his father into a prisoner of guilt. So he chose another path, the path Maeve had unknowingly shown him, the path of truth and real justice instead of punishment carried out in darkness. The moment the handcuffs closed around Corinne's wrists, the cold confidence on her face collapsed completely for the first time. She stared at Kieran in disbelief, unable to comprehend that a man from the underworld had delivered her into the hands of the law. Finn had already broken entirely, confessing everything in the hope of receiving a lighter sentence. Both were led away before the eyes of the people who had once feared and respected them, and along with them, an entire network of embezzlement and crimes buried for 3 years was finally dragged into the light. But to Kieran, capturing those responsible was only half of justice. The other half, the part he valued more than anything, was restoring the good name of the woman who had carried that injustice for 3 years. To accomplish that, he needed one crucial link, Dr. Prescott. The physician who had worked alongside Maeve on that fateful night, the only person in the medical profession who still remembered and believed in her dedication. For 3 years he had been tormented by the fact that he had done nothing, while watching his colleague be falsely blamed, yet he had been too afraid of the power behind the conspiracy to speak. Now that the truth had been exposed and the masterminds had been arrested, he no longer had any reason to remain silent. He came forward to testify, confirming that Maeve's original notes had been altered, that she had handled Julian's treatment according to proper procedure, and that she had even been the first person to warn of the abnormal symptoms that had now been proven to result from poisoning. His testimony, together with the original medical records and the forensic findings, formed undeniable proof of Maeve's innocence, and the legal process to restore her reputation and nursing license began. Yet the most beautiful part of everything that happened wasn't that Kieran used his power to save her. It was that, in the end, the truth itself saved her. The dedication and honesty she had held on to even during that fateful night, the very things that had seemed buried forever, returned to clear her name. Maeve's dignity wasn't restored as a gift handed down by a powerful man. She reclaimed it through everything she had done right from the beginning, and that was what allowed her to hold her head high. On the day she was officially exonerated, when her name was cleared of every accusation and her nursing license was restored, she stood in silence for a very long time. 3 years of having the entire world turn against her, 3 years of living at the bottom beneath the weight of a crime she hadn't committed, had finally come to an end. She began to cry, but this time the tears weren't born of humiliation or loss. They were the tears of a woman who had finally been given herself back. She thought of Hollis, of the man who had died for her, without living long enough to see this day, and she silently promised him that she wouldn't waste the life he had sacrificed to save. As for Kieran, surrendering Corinne and Finn to the law also meant accepting that part of the darkness within Voss Group would be exposed, and he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But standing before his father's final request, and the example of the woman who had taught him that kindness was strength rather than weakness, he decided that he would dismantle the shadow empire his father had left behind, piece by piece, move whatever could be moved into the light, and cut away everything rotten. He couldn't erase his past, but he could choose to spend the rest of his life becoming someone different from the man his father had shaped him to be. Someone Julian, had he still been alive, might have been proud to call his brother. And for the first time in many years, when Kieran looked ahead, he didn't see darkness. He saw the faint but genuine light of a new beginning, A few weeks after every storm had passed, on a spring morning when the first sunlight of the day poured gold across the streets of Boston, Kieran came to Maeve carrying a small box in his hand, and when she opened it, she fell completely still, because inside was the brass pocket watch that had belonged to her late husband, the watch that had shattered beneath Kieran's foot on that fateful morning. But now it had been made whole again. Every broken piece had been patiently restored over many weeks, by the finest craftsmen Kieran could find. The hands moved steadily once more. The glass was clear again, and when Maeve pressed it into her palm, she heard the soft ticking she had believed was lost forever. Kieran quietly told her that he couldn't return the years she had lost, and he couldn't undo the pain his world had caused her, but at the very least, he wanted to return the thing he had broken with his own hands. With tears shimmering in her eyes, Maeve understood that the gift was more than a watch. It was the fullest apology he could ever offer, closing the circle that had begun between them on that cold morning so long ago. She didn't return to work in the great hospitals that had once rejected her. Instead, she used everything she had endured to open a free clinic for homeless people, those who lived at the edges of society, and whom the world had trained itself to overlook. She understood better than anyone what it felt like to be seen as though she were invisible, so she made the clinic a place where everyone who entered was welcomed with a respectful gaze and a kind greeting. She placed Hollis's old knit cap on her desk, so that every day she would remember the man who had traded his life for the chance to give her this future, and she devoted herself completely to her work as a way of honoring his sacrifice. Kieran quietly stood behind her throughout that journey. He funded the clinic but never sought attention for it, and day by day he continued dismantling the darkest parts of the empire he had inherited, bringing whatever he could into the light. Yet the greatest miracle wasn't found in power or money, but in the quiet transformation taking place inside him, because one morning, at the very corner of the financial district where everything had begun, people saw the man who had once made an entire city hold its breath stop beside a homeless person huddled against the cold. He bent down, placed a cup of hot coffee into that person's hands himself, looked directly into their eyes, and offered a kind greeting, the very thing he never would have done 3 years earlier. When he looked up, Maeve was standing there watching him, a smile spreading across her lips. She stepped closer and quietly said that someone had finally managed to teach him some manners. Kieran looked at her, his eyes warm in a way no one could have imagined on that cold morning years before, and answered that it hadn't been his mother who taught him. It had been her. In that moment, amid the passing crowds of a city that was always in a hurry, two people who had once stood at opposite ends of life finally found each other and discovered a new beginning. One had possessed everything but lost himself, while the other had lost everything but never surrendered her dignity. They found their way not through power or wealth, but through something simple that the world sometimes forgets: kindness and respect for another human being. The story of Maeve and Kieran leaves us with a profound lesson, that a person's dignity isn't determined by whether they are rich or poor, by their position or possessions, but by the way they preserve their self-respect and kindness even when life has taken everything from them. Kindness has never been weakness. It is the greatest strength of all, a power capable of healing even the hearts that seem most hardened, and the way we treat those who can offer us nothing in return is the truest measure of our character. In a busy world where people so easily pass one another without ever stopping, may this story remind us to truly see each other, to offer one another a glance, a greeting, and respect, because sometimes that small act can save an entire life. If this story touched your heart, if Maeve made you believe that dignity can't be taken away by circumstances, and that kind people deserve happiness, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so you can hear more meaningful and compelling stories every day. We would also love to know how this story made you feel. Have you ever encountered people in real life who had been forgotten at the edges of society? Or have you ever received kindness from a stranger at the moment you needed it most? Please leave a comment and share what you feel from the depths of your heart, because we always value every story and every emotion you share with us. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the stories to come.